4 flood stories survive from the ancient Near East, and every single one of them keeps going after the water goes down. That part, the part after, is where they stop agreeing with each other. The flood itself is nearly identical across all 4. A man gets a warning. He builds a boat. Animals go in. Water covers everything. Birds get sent out to test for dry land. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. The man builds an altar and burns an offering, and the god or the gods smell the smoke. You can lay the Hebrew version beside the cuneiform versions and watch the same beats land in the same order. Scholars have known this since a young curator at the British Museum named George Smith read a flood tablet out loud in 1872 and reportedly started tearing off his clothes in excitement. But the endings. The endings are 4 different arguments about what kind of world we live in, written by people who were arguing with each other on purpose. And the ending of the Hebrew version is Genesis chapters 9, 10, and 11. The drunk man in the tent, the curse on a grandson who wasn't there, the bow in the cloud, the tower, the scattering of languages. That whole stretch that gets read fast in church and skipped entirely in the children's version. That's where we're spending the next half hour, not on whether the flood happened, on what the people who wrote the ending were trying to say, and what the neighbors' endings tell us about why they said it that way. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe and drop a like before we get going. It genuinely helps this reach the next person who's been quietly curious about these chapters for years. Here's something worth noticing before we open a single text. If you grew up in the United States, you probably met this story painted on a nursery wall. 2 giraffes, a smiling boat, a rainbow arcing over the changing table. Maybe you had the little plastic ark with the ramp that snapped down. Maybe your family drove to Williamstown, Kentucky, where a full-scale ark opened in 2016 at a cost north of $100 million, 510 feet of engineered timber sitting in a field off Interstate 75. Every culture that has ever held this story has done the same thing with it. It gets built into something. A clay tablet copied by a student scribe, a felt board, a theme park. The medium changes completely. The impulse doesn't. This story keeps getting used to teach people what the world is like and why it's like that, which is exactly what its original ending was designed to do. In the ancient world, a flood story wasn't a rescue story. It was an origin story for the human condition. The question the whole genre exists to answer comes at the end, and it's a hard one. What stops this from happening again? 3 of the 4 surviving answers are almost the same. The 4th one, the Hebrew one, refuses. Start with the oldest full version we have, because you can't hear what Genesis is doing until you've heard what it's answering. It's called the Atrahasis epic. That's Atra-hasīs, a name that means something like exceedingly wise. Our best copy was written on 3 tablets by a junior scribe named Kuaya, working in Babylonia around the year 1600 BCE. That's roughly 1,000 years before most scholars date the Hebrew flood account. The standard scholarly edition came out in 1969 by Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard, both working out of Britain, and it changed how everybody read Genesis. The story opens before humans exist. The lower gods are doing manual labor, digging the irrigation canals, hauling the dirt, and they go on strike. Set down your tools, burn the baskets, march on the chief god's house at night. To settle it, a birth goddess named Nintu mixes clay with the blood of a slaughtered god and makes people, and the people take over the work. Then people multiply. And the epic says something startling about why that becomes a problem. The land was bellowing like a bull. The noise of humanity kept the chief god, Enlil, awake. That's the reason. Not wickedness. Noise. Too many people, too much racket, a god who can't sleep. So Enlil tries to reduce the population. First, a plague. The humans, coached by the clever god Enki, direct all their offerings to the plague god, and he backs off. Then drought. Same trick. Then famine, brutal enough that the tablet describes daughters being eaten. Each time, the humans find a workaround. And when nothing works, Enlil calls for the flood. Notice the structure, because it matters. The flood in Atrahasis is the 4th attempt at a fix. It's the escalation after 3 failures. The gods have been trying to manage a problem they created, badly, for generations, and the flood is what you get when management gives up. Then the water comes, and the boat, and the mountain, and the sacrifice. The same beats, you know. The gods gather around the smoke of the offering like flies, which is one of the most unflattering lines any ancient scribe ever wrote about his own gods. And now the ending. Enlil is furious that anyone survived. Enki argues back, and the 2 of them, along with the birth goddess, sit down and redesign the human race so that the flood never has to be repeated. Here is what they install permanently into human life. 1/3 of women will not bear children. A demon called the Pashitu is created and given a job to snatch infants from their mother's laps. And 3 classes of priestesses are established who are forbidden to give birth at all. That's the epilogue. Infertility, infant death, and religious celibacy. Presented as the divine solution to overpopulation, written into the species so that no future flood is necessary. Tikva Frymer-Kensky, who taught at the University of Chicago Divinity School, published a landmark article on this in the journal Biblical Archaeologist in 1977, and her point was simple and devastating in the best way. The Atrahasis ending explains why life hurts, why babies die, why some women can't conceive. It's a theodicy, an answer to suffering, dressed as a story about a boat. The flood story, in its oldest complete form, exists to justify the world you actually live in. The Babylonians told it again, centuries later, folded into the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the ending shifted. In the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh, the copies we read best come from the library at Nineveh, buried when that city burned in 612 BCE, and translated into English most authoritatively by Andrew George of the University of London. The flood survivor is called Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh has crossed the waters of death to find him, because Utnapishtim is the one human being who never died, and Gilgamesh wants to know how. Same flood, same boat, same birds, same mountain, same smoke. And then the ending does 2 things Genesis will pointedly not do. First, the god Ea scolds Enlil for the flood, and he proposes alternatives. Instead of a flood, he says, let a lion come and reduce the people. Let a wolf come. Let famine come. Let the plague gods strike them down. Reduce humanity, but do it in installments. Read that again with Genesis in your ear. The Babylonian gods swear off the flood and immediately replace it with predators, hunger, and disease. The promise not to drown the world is not a promise to leave the world alone. It's a substitution. Second, Enlil comes down to the boat, takes Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand, blesses them, and grants them eternal life at the mouth of the rivers, far away. The flood hero gets promoted out of the human race. That's the reward. In the Sumerian version, older still, the hero is called Zusudra, Z-U-Sodra, a name that literally means life of long days. And he gets the same thing, life like a god's, and a permanent address in the land of Dilmun. So there's your genre. 3 endings, 3 variations on the same answer. The flood happened because humanity was a problem. The flood is not repeated because the problem gets permanently managed, through barrenness, through infant mortality, through lions and famine and plague. And the man who survived is lifted out of the human condition entirely. That's the world the Hebrew writers were living in, not as an academic curiosity. Judeans were deported to Babylonia after Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE, and they lived in the empire whose scribal schools copied these tablets as classroom exercises. Many historians think that's precisely when large parts of Genesis reached the shape we have. That contact goes further than flood stories, by the way. The gods in these tablets, the ones with the temples and the priesthoods, are not strangers to the Hebrew Bible. Several of them appear in it by name, with festivals and shrines and royal funding. If you've never followed that thread, there's a video here on the channel called 7 Other Gods in the Hebrew Bible. What the history shows, and it walks the same ground from the other direction. Worth sitting with after this one. Because once you know what the neighbor's ending said, Genesis chapter 8, verse 21, stops looking like an embarrassment. It starts looking like a rebuttal. Here's the Hebrew ending. The boat lands, Noah builds an altar, the smoke goes up, and God speaks. First to himself, in the text's own framing, in his heart. The King James renders it this way: I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sock, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. The New International puts it, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. Sit on those 2 English versions for a second, because that's not a translator being sloppy. That's one small Hebrew word, ki, which can mean because and can mean even though, and the whole theological weight of the verse swings on which one you pick. The King James makes human evil the reason God holds back. The New International makes it the obstacle God overrides. Translators have argued about that particle for centuries, and the honest position is that the Hebrew supports both readings. Either way, the substance is the same, and it's the substance that matters here. Before the flood, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, The stated diagnosis is that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. After the flood, in chapter 8, verse 21, the diagnosis is repeated almost word for word. The inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. And this time, it's the basis for a promise never to do it again. Same diagnosis. Opposite conclusion. Now, plenty of people meet that verse and hear a failure. The flood didn't work. The problem's still there. The whole thing was pointless. I understand why it lands that way, and I sat with that reading for a long time myself. But put it back in the room where it was written, next to Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, and something else happens. The genre asks, what prevents a repeat? Atrahasis answers, sterilize a third of the women and let a demon take the infants. Gilgamesh answers, send lions, famine, and plague instead. Both answers fix the flood problem by permanently damaging human beings. Genesis answers, nothing changes about humanity. The restraint goes on God. That is a genuinely radical piece of ancient writing. The Hebrew author knows the standard ending. The parallels are too tight for him not to, and he declines it. He refuses to explain infant death as a divine population program. He refuses to make barrenness a policy. He looks at the same human condition the Babylonian scribes looked at, agrees it's unchanged, and puts the limit on the divine side of the relationship instead of the human side. Whether you find that comforting or troubling is your call, and both reactions are defensible. What it isn't is careless. It's a deliberate answer to a question the whole ancient world was asking, and it's the Minority Report. And it never gets taught that way, not because anyone's hiding it, but because you can't hear a rebuttal if you've never heard the argument it's rebutting. Sunday school doesn't teach Atrahasis. Neither does most seminary preaching, honestly. The tablets sat under a mound of dirt in Iraq until the 1800s. 2,000 years of Christian reading of Genesis chapter 8 happened with no access to the thing Genesis chapter 8 is talking back to. That's not a cover-up. That's an accident of archaeology. And it got corrected in our lifetime. So what does Genesis install in place of the Babylonian machinery? Because a flood story has to install something. That's the genre's job. It installs law. Look at Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. Humans get told to be fruitful and multiply. The exact opposite of the Atrahasis solution, where the whole problem was too many people. Then permission to eat animal flesh, with one restriction, not with the blood still in it. Then the line that carries all the weight. Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. Frymer-Kensky's argument, and it's been widely picked up since, is that this is a structural swap. In the Mesopotamian version, divine violence keeps the population in check. In the Hebrew version, human courts do it. The check moves from heaven to the village. Bloodshed is now a problem that people handle, with rules on the ground. You can agree or disagree with how well that works out in practice. But as a piece of ancient thinking, it's a real move. The transfer of enforcement from the gods to human institutions, right at the moment the world restarts. And then comes the sign. Genesis chapter 9, verse 13. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. The Hebrew word there is keshet, keshet. It is not a special word for a weather phenomenon. It's the ordinary word for a bow, the thing you shoot arrows with. It's the word used for the weapon in the hands of soldiers throughout the Hebrew Bible. Nahum Sarna, in the Jewish Publication Society commentary on Genesis, and a long line of scholars with him, read that as the point. The image is a warrior hanging up his bow, pointed away from the earth, up into the clouds, unstrung. A weapon set down where everyone can see it's been set down. And there's a cousin to that image in Babylonian literature. In the creation Epic Enuma Elish, Enuma Lish. The storm god Marduk wins the cosmic battle, and his father Anu takes Marduk's bow and sets it in the sky as a constellation. The bow in the heavens as a permanent monument to a war that's over. Which brings in the philosopher whose name is on this video, and he arrives here for a very specific reason. In 1670, a Dutch thinker named Baruch Spinoza was writing a chapter about what people actually mean when they call something a sign from God, and he reached for this exact verse. His observation was almost blunt. The bow in the cloud is a bow in a cloud. Sunlight, water, refraction. Scripture doesn't claim the thing was invented that afternoon. It says a meaning was assigned to something that was already there. That distinction is the whole of his method in one stroke. A sign isn't nature being interrupted. A sign is nature being read. And once you take that seriously, the rainbow gets more interesting, not less. Nobody's telling you the physics is fake. Somebody's telling you that a people who had just survived catastrophe looked at an ordinary arc of light and decided to call it a weapon laid down. That's not a smaller story than the one on the nursery wall. It's a much older and much stranger one. Now, the vineyard. Genesis chapter 9, verse 20. Noah, the man of the soil, plants a vineyard, drinks the wine, and lies uncovered in his tent. The reaction most Americans have to that line was manufactured fairly recently, and I want to name it, because it's a clean example of how a culture teaches you what to feel about a verse before you ever read it. In 1869, a Methodist dentist named Thomas Bramwell Welch, living in Vineland, New Jersey, and serving as communion steward at his church, pasteurized grape juice so his congregation could take the sacrament without alcohol. He called it Dr. Welch's unfermented wine. Within a couple of generations, and with the temperance movement doing the heavy lifting, those little plastic cups of grape juice on a silver tray became the default communion experience for most American Protestants. So if you grew up in a Baptist or Methodist or non-denominational church, drunkenness is not a neutral topic in your Bible. It's the topic. Noah with a vineyard reads to you as a moral collapse in verse 20 of the New World's first chapter. To the people who wrote it, the vineyard was the payoff. Go back 4 chapters. Genesis chapter 5, verse 29. Noah's father names him and gives a reason. This one shall comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. The Hebrew is a wordplay. The name Noah sounds like the word for relief or comfort. He's named for the promise of relief from cursed soil. Then the flood ends, and in chapter 8, the ground stops being cursed, and in chapter 9, the man named Relief plants the first vineyard. Wine, in ancient Israelite literature, is the standard image for the land producing joy rather than misery. The naming prophecy pays off. The writers built that. It's a piece of narrative architecture stretching across 4 chapters, and the Sunday school version can't use it because the Sunday school version can't get past the drinking. Now compare heroes. Utnapishtim gets immortality and a home at the mouth of the rivers. Zusudra gets life like a god's. Noah gets a farm. He plants, he drinks, he sleeps, he wakes up angry, he lives 350 more years, and then Genesis chapter 9, verse 29 says he died. That verse is doing something. The Hebrew writer takes the one figure in the entire ancient Near East who traditionally escapes death, and he closes the account with a death notice. No promotion, no island, no exemption. The flood hero stays human and gets buried like everyone else. If you were raised to think the Bible flatters its heroes, that ending should stop you. This tradition consistently refuses the upgrade its neighbors offered. If any of this is landing, a like on this one actually matters. It's how the next curious person finds it instead of finding an argument. And if you know somebody who's been holding questions about these chapters since they were 15, send it to them. Not to change their mind, just so they know the questions have a literature. Then something happens in the tent, and this is where I have to be careful, because the honest answer is that scholars have argued about it for 2,000 years and have not settled it. Genesis chapter 9, verse 22 says Ham saw the nakedness of his father and told his brothers outside. His brothers walk in backward with a garment over their shoulders and cover him without looking. Noah wakes and, verse 24, knew what his younger son had done unto him. 3 things create the puzzle. First, the phrase, see the nakedness of. In Leviticus chapters 18 and 20, the legal material that shares a tradition with parts of Genesis. The closely related phrase, uncover the nakedness of, is a standard legal idiom for sexual violation, not for accidental sight. Second, the brothers' elaborate care not to see suggests the text treats seeing as a real offense in itself. Third, done unto him is a strange way to describe looking. From there, readings split, and they have been splitting since antiquity. The Book of Jubilees, a Jewish retelling of Genesis from roughly the 2nd century BCE, tells it flatly as looking. Ham saw, went out, told his brothers, and that's the offense. So one ancient Jewish community read it as a shame violation, full stop, and that's a serious data point. The Babylonian Talmud, in Tractate Sanhedrin, preserves a rabbinic debate in which one opinion holds that Ham castrated his father and another holds he committed a sexual act. Those rabbis clearly felt the same friction you feel, and they said so out loud, in writing, in the 5th century. In modern scholarship, John Bergsma and Scott Hahn published an argument in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 2005 that the idiom points to an act involving Noah's wife, which would explain why the consequence falls on a son born of it. Other scholars, Claus Westermann among them, held that the plain reading of looking and gossiping is sufficient in an honor culture where a father's exposure was a genuine violation. I'm not going to hand you a verdict, because the field doesn't have one. What I can tell you with confidence is this. The discomfort you feel reading Genesis chapter 9 is not modern squeamishness, and it's not a lack of faith. It is documented in Jewish interpretation within a few centuries of the text's circulation. People have been standing exactly where you're standing since before the Second Temple fell. That's worth holding on to in general. When a passage feels off to you, check whether ancient readers thought so too. Very often they did, and they left notes. The Dead Sea Scrolls give one more glimpse of that wrestling. In 2013, researchers Elisha Qimron, Hanan Ariel, and Alexei Udisky, working with the newly digitized high-resolution images of the scrolls, proposed a fresh reading in one fragmentary text that ties Canaan's punishment to a land dispute. Canaan settling where he had no right to settle. Whether or not that reading holds up, and it's debated, it shows something useful. Ancient interpreters were already unsatisfied with the story as told and were already generating explanations, which is exactly the problem the next verse creates. Noah wakes up, and the curse does not land on Ham. Genesis chapter 9, verse 25. Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. Canaan is Ham's son. He is not in the tent. He has not appeared in the story. He enters the narrative to receive a punishment and exits immediately after. Ancient readers noticed. That's the thing to hold on to. Jubilees noticed and retold it with Noah cursing his younger son in a way that smooths the seam. The rabbis noticed and proposed that Canaan was the actual offender, or that Noah couldn't curse Ham because God had already blessed him 4 verses earlier. Christian commentators noticed. Everybody noticed for 2,000 years and generated explanations, which is what people do when a text has a visible seam in it. The mainstream historical explanation now is straightforward, and it's taught in standard university introductions to the Hebrew Bible across the theological spectrum. Look at who Canaan is in the rest of the book. Canaan is the name of the land Israel occupies. The Canaanites are the population Israelite tradition remembers displacing. And the curse formula here, servant of servants, subordinate to the descendants of Shem, is not a comment on a family incident. It's a statement about the political relationship between two peoples. Historians describe this as etiology, a story that explains a present arrangement by locating its origin in the deep past. The world contains a fact. Israelites live in Canaan, and Canaanite populations are subordinate to them. The story supplies a cause. And in a genealogical culture, causes are ancestors. There's a linguistic wrinkle that makes the political function even clearer. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 files Canaan under Ham, alongside Egypt, Cush, and Put, African and Egyptian sphere peoples. But Canaanite was a Northwest Semitic language, so close to Hebrew that Hebrew is essentially a Canaanite dialect. Linguistically, Canaan belongs with Shem. Geographically and politically, Canaan spent the late Bronze Age under Egyptian imperial control, and Egypt is Ham's son in this list. So the Table of Nations isn't organizing the world by language or by race. It's organizing it by political geography as an Iron Age writer understood it. That single observation dissolves an enormous amount of later misuse. And we'll get to that misuse in a minute, because it has an American address. One more piece. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, in the same body of literature, states the principle plainly. Parents shall not be put to death for their children, nor children for their parents. Each shall die for his own sin. And the prophet Ezekiel, in chapter 18, spends an entire chapter attacking the proverb about fathers eating sour grapes and children's teeth being set on edge. That's not the Bible contradicting itself by accident. That's a tradition arguing with itself over centuries about inherited guilt in writing in the same canon. Genesis 9 represents an older assumption. Deuteronomy and Ezekiel represent a later one pushing back hard. You were probably handed the result as a single, seamless voice. It was never a single voice. It was a conversation, and the conversation is still visible if you read the participants next to each other. Now the American part, because this particular verse did more damage in the United States than almost any other line in Genesis, and the history of that is well documented. The text says Canaan. The text says nothing about skin color, nothing about Africa, nothing about a physical mark. Those elements are absent from the Hebrew, absent from the Greek Septuagint, absent from the earliest Jewish interpretation. David Goldenberg, who taught at the University of Pennsylvania, traced this in a book called The Curse of Ham, published by Princeton University Press in 2003. His finding was that the association of Ham with black Africans developed gradually in late antiquity and the medieval period, partly through a folk etymology linking the name Ham to a word for dark or hot, an etymology that doesn't hold up in Hebrew. Stephen Haynes, at Rhodes College in Memphis, followed the American chapter in Noah's Curse, published by Oxford in 2002. By the 1840s and 50s, the passage was doing heavy work in defenses of slavery. Josiah Priest published a widely read volume in 1843 built around it. Ministers preached it from pulpits in Charleston and Richmond and New Orleans. A verse about a subordinate people in the Bronze Age Levant became a scriptural justification for chattel slavery in Mississippi, and every single step of that required adding material the text doesn't contain. You have to move the curse from Canaan to Ham. You have to attach Ham to Africa. You have to attach Africa to a permanent hereditary status. 3 additions, none of them in the Hebrew. The correction has a paper trail too. In 1995, at its 150th anniversary meeting, the Southern Baptist Convention, a denomination founded in 1845 in a split over slaveholding missionaries, passed a formal resolution apologizing for condoning and perpetuating racism and repudiating that history. You can read the resolution on their own website. Whatever you think of institutions, that document exists, and it exists because the interpretation was recognized as an interpretation and not as the text. This is what historians mean when they talk about the difference between a text and its reception. The words on the scroll stayed the same for 3,000 years. What people did with those words changed radically, depending on what they needed the words to authorize. That's the mechanism, not conspiracy. Interest. Reading under pressure, by people who wanted an answer and found one. And that's also the strongest possible argument for learning to read these chapters in their own setting. Because the defense against a text being weaponized is knowing what it actually says and who it was actually about. If this is useful to you, share it with somebody who was handed a version of Genesis 9 that nobody ever unpacked for them. There are a lot of us. 2 chapters later, the epilogue does something that anyone with a Bible and a free afternoon can verify without knowing a word of Hebrew. Genesis chapter 10 is the Table of Nations. 70 peoples descended from Noah's 3 sons, mapped across the known world, and 3 separate times, in verse 5, verse 20, and verse 31. The text describes those descendants settling in their territories, and the phrase is, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Different languages, already distributed, 3 times. Turn the page. Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Then the tower, then the scattering, then the explanation of how languages came to be different. The explanation arrives 1 chapter after the situation it explains. Now, there are 2 serious ways scholars handle this, and I want you to have both. The traditional harmonizing reading, argued carefully by the Italian-Israeli scholar Umberto Cassuto, among others, is that Hebrew narrative regularly works in a wide-angle then close-up pattern. Chapter 10 gives you the finished map. Chapter 11 backs up to tell you how the map got that way. Ancient storytelling doesn't always run on a clock. The source-critical reading, which is the majority position in university biblical studies, is that these are 2 originally separate compositions placed side by side by a compiler. The Table of Nations shows the vocabulary, the structure, and the interest in genealogy and boundaries characteristic of one strand of Genesis. The Babel story shows the vivid, ground-level, dialogue-heavy style of another. 2 accounts of how humanity spread out, preserved next to each other rather than merged. Both readings are held by competent people. What neither reading supports is the idea that this is a single flowing account by a single author, and you don't need a degree to see why. You need chapter 10 and chapter 11 open at the same time. The choice to preserve both is the part I find genuinely moving, and I don't think that's sentimental. A compiler with an editing pen had 2 versions of a foundational story in front of him. He could have picked one. He kept both. That's a decision about custody. The sense that these texts were received, not owned. Modern textual work keeps finding that same instinct. When you compare the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts of Genesis against the traditional Hebrew text and the ancient Greek translation, you find a tradition that generally protected what it inherited even where it didn't smooth it out. Whoever handed you these chapters as one seamless story probably wasn't concealing anything. They likely learned it that way themselves, from someone who learned it that way. Simplification is what happens when a complex thing has to be taught in 40 minutes to 9-year-olds, every week, for centuries. It isn't malice, it's compression. And compression always loses the seams, which is a shame, because the seams are where you can see human hands. The tower itself is the one place in this whole epilogue where archaeology hands you the building. Genesis chapter 11, verse 3, describes the construction method with unusual precision. They had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. Baked brick and bitumen. That is exactly right for southern Mesopotamia, where there's no quarry stone and where bitumen seeps out of the ground, and exactly wrong for the hills of Canaan, where you build with stone. The writer knows Babylonian construction from the inside. And then the pun. The Babylonians understood their city's name, Bab-elim, as Gate of the God. The Hebrew text takes that name and connects it to the verb balal, ba'alal, meaning to confuse or mix up. Genesis chapter 11, verse 9, therefore is the name of it called Babal, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. Gate of God becomes gibberish. That's a bilingual joke, made by people living inside the empire whose capital they're renaming. It's the humor of the occupied, and it's razor sharp. There's one more piece of craft. The tower builders say, in verse 4, let us make us a name. One chapter later, in Genesis chapter 12, God tells Abram, I will make thy name great. The thing the builders tried to seize gets given away, freely, to a man leaving the city. The whole Babel episode is constructed as the setup for that line. And then the sentence that has bothered readers for as long as readers have existed, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. Came down. To see. Spinoza's handling of this kind of language is the most useful thing anyone has said about it in 400 years, and it isn't a dodge. His argument was that Scripture speaks in the images available to the people telling the story, and that when it describes God descending, walking, smelling smoke, or being grieved, it's telling you about the imagination of the narrator, not delivering a report on celestial mechanics. Read it as the language of its own century, and there's no contradiction to explain, because no claim about physics was ever being made. That's not a way of getting God off the hook. It's a way of getting the text back, as literature written by particular people in a particular place who pictured their God the way a person in Babylonia in the 6th century BCE would picture a great king, coming down from the height to inspect the work. Step back and look at the whole epilogue at once, because the pattern only appears from a distance. A flood story in the ancient Near East had a job to do at the end. It had to explain why the catastrophe wouldn't repeat, and every version answered by naming what got changed. Atrahasis changed women's fertility. Gilgamesh changed the menu of divine punishments. Both left the man on the boat outside the human race. And the pattern isn't Jewish or Christian. It's human. Every tradition on earth that lasts long enough goes through the same processes: oral telling, writing, copying, translation, compilation, simplification for teaching, and then reinterpretation under pressure from whatever the present needs. The Vedas went through it. The Quran's early reciters and copyists went through their own version of it. The Buddhist canon went through it in 3 languages. If you find these processes disturbing in one tradition, the honest move is to notice they're operating in all of them, including the secular stories cultures tell about themselves. Which brings this back to you, sitting there with whatever you were handed as a kid. If you were the child who raised a hand and asked why Canaan got punished, you weren't being difficult. You were reading. If you were the teenager who noticed the languages problem between chapter 10 and chapter 11 and got told to stop looking for trouble, you weren't looking for trouble. You'd found a seam that scholars have been writing about since the 1700s. If you sat through years of flood sermons with a knot in your stomach about the children who drowned, that knot was not a failure of faith. Every serious commentator in this history has had it, and some of them wrote whole books out of it. Spinoza's answer to all of this wasn't loss. It was that understanding a thing by its causes is the best available human state, not a consolation prize you accept after belief gets complicated, but the actual substance of a good life. You don't get pushed around by an image once you know where the image came from. The bow in the cloud doesn't shrink when you learn it was a weapon being set down by people who had survived something terrible. It gets larger and older and more theirs and somehow more yours. You end up with more than you started with. 4 flood stories instead of 1. A 3,000-year argument about inherited guilt that you get to be part of. A joke about the gate of the gods, told by exiles, that still works. So here's what I want in the comments. What's the first place you remember meeting Noah's Ark? The nursery wall, the toy, the felt board, the road trip to Kentucky? And what did that version leave out that you only found later? I read them all, and the answers to this one always surprise me. If you want more of this, subscribe and pass this to whoever needs it. And when you're ready for the next thread, the gods who had temples and priests and royal funding inside the Hebrew Bible itself, sitting right there by name. That's 7 other gods in the Hebrew Bible. What the history shows here on the channel. If you haven't sat with that one yet, it picks up exactly where this leaves off. The water went down in a single verse. Everything those writers actually believed is in what they wrote next.